using the ground cleanup tool in LP360. We're also going to cover a few manual options for your ground classification cleanup. So for cleanup, there's not going to be quite as many steps as there are with ground classification, but there are still a lot of helpful things to do. So this is the project that I processed in our previous training session. For those of you that may not have a classified data set for this particular LAS, you can use any training data set or any data set that is classified in this exercise. Once again, it will be recorded and can be referred to at any later time. So today we will primarily be focusing on all the different ways in which you can clean up the classification of your ground surface. Now, in our previous session, we discussed the two primary ground classification options in LP360. That is going to be your AI ground classification method and your adaptive 10 method, which, as we saw when we reviewed our results, I will switch between them here on my screen. You can see that it looks like our adaptive 10 method might need a little bit more cleanup than our AI ground. Either way, all ground classification methods do require some level of cleanup, so it is very important to assess the quality of your point cloud after classification. Now, one way you can also review and assess the overall continuity of your ground class is by running what's called surface precision. This is entirely optional. And once again, this training is to show you all the options you have available to you during this process. Now, just to demonstrate that tool, I will go up to my QA/QC tab. This will also be covered in the QA/QC training session tomorrow afternoon. And surface precision. It does require additional licensing, so that's what I'm going to check out right now, just for demonstration purposes. You guys do not have to do this if you do not wish. It can either be enabled by the Business Intelligence Tool license, which is used for all of our advanced classification processes, such as power line extraction, rail extraction, building extraction, and tree segmentation. It can also be enabled by strip adjustment and strip align licenses. So if you have any of these available to you, you can also use this tool. Here we are. So surface precision looks at the level of detected noise on planar surfaces, or in this case, ground. So for my input, I will use my ground system only. So enabling only my ground for this review process. I will also look at it globally. As you can see, there are different options. Once again, all of these options will be covered in our next training session tomorrow in the QA/QC training. But for today, this is just a general cover of how to assess the continuity of your ground. In our previous exercise, I believe we used a cell size of 3 to classify our seed surface. So for this, I will also use that same value. You can also specify the pass-fail threshold you would like to view. This helps you identify areas that meet a specific criteria. So by default, it's going to select 0.065 feet as my threshold. Anything under that will be flagged in green. Anything higher will be flagged in red or yellow. If you would like to review the specific intervals used, you can open up your advanced settings and review your intervals as you see here. Okay. All right. So I am just going to run this really quickly. Once again, this is just for review processes and it is entirely optional. Now in my map view, you can see my raster and it has highlighted several places in red, indicating that it did find some ground points that fell outside of that threshold specified in the dialog. So using this tool, I would be able to focus in on these areas versus my entire data set. So it helps to visualize areas that may need more attention than others during your classification process. When I look back at my point cloud, I can also see that some of these colorized areas seem to fall around these voids. These voids are likely where there is an object above the ground, whether it is vegetation, buildings, cars, anything of that nature. It may have a little bit more difficult time classifying underneath this surface. Now, to visualize the particular object in this area to help us clean up our ground around this, you can either use your 3D viewer to draw a small view box, like I am doing here, and changing this to all systems to see what is above the surface. Now, from what I can tell, it appears there's either going to be some low-lying vegetation, or more than likely, this is going to be another stockpile of sorts with low-lying vegetation on top. So that means this is okay to classify. As I mentioned, you can do that over multiple areas. So if you viewed by classification with all of your points, you can also see all the areas in gray that have not been classified. This assessment can also be taken into the immersive view to display all of the points in a more in-depth viewer. As we can see here, it appears we might have some more low-lying vegetation, or more than likely some dirt piles here, because your vegetation is going to look a little more sparse and a little more spotty. Typically, your surfaces will have a more refined pattern of points found upon their surface. Here in our big void that we can see there, we are underneath a large bit of canopy, which can prevent our LiDAR system from reaching down to that surface. So in this particular area, we may not be able to do a whole lot of cleanup because there may not be enough points on the ground surface to detect. That is something to keep in mind when you are flying your own missions and collecting your own UAV data, is if you do have anywhere with dense vegetation, it is recommended to fly in a cross-hatch pattern to allow you improved capability of canopy penetration. You may also notice, if I look here, it did not do a great job of cleaning up some of my curbs and classifying those as well. This can be due to a variety of different reasons, whether it be that the algorithm recognize these as an above ground surface or some other object. We can very easily clean this up using some of our tools. Now, the main one I would like to talk about today is actually our ground cleanup tool. That can be found on the ground classification ribbon. It will be called just cleanup here. Once you open it up, there are a couple of different options that can be used to execute this tool. Now, the first one I will talk about is the manual ground cleanup. Now, when I click Add Ground, once again, I always recommend you read these helpful tips when using a new classification tool, just because it can have a lot of helpful tips and tricks on how to make your classification as easy as possible. Once that has been enabled, you'll see that I have this nice little icon here, which is the Classify by Polygon option. Now, this option can be used in multiple views. So right now, I can start drawing in my immersive viewer here. I'm going to draw a polygon right around my curve, and you'll see how those points start to highlight. You may also notice that it did not highlight any of the existing ground. That is because this particular tool already has a filter in place to only look for unclassified or created and never classified points. Okay. Once you are satisfied with your point selection, you can click Spacebar. If you see this pop up, it is just letting you know that you have selected over 500,000 points and therefore cannot use the Undo Classification button. That is perfectly okay. We're going to click Yes. You may notice that these points did not turn orange as our typical ground points. That is because this tool also utilizes a temporary class for storage so that you can confirm that the results are as you expect them to be. If you are satisfied with those, in this case, I am satisfied with my curb selection here, I will come up here and click Commit Edits. That will then commit these points to the ground classification class. You'll see here where it says next to Edits, in parentheses, it has 20. That is going to be the number of the class that is used for temporary storage. This is also named the ignored ground class. Here, for our ground class, you'll see that it is class 2. It is asking to confirm that I would like to move my edits to the ground class. In this case, the answer is yes. It will perform a basic filter for you automatically to perform this process. This does not just need to be done in the immersive view. You can also do it in the map view itself. However, when you're looking in the map view, which if I close this out, you may notice it's a little more difficult to actually find the ground surface during this classification process, hence why I started in my immersive view. If you choose to use the map view for this process, I would recommend changing to a 10 to allow you to better visualize the surface itself and the above ground features. So for this example, I could zoom out and find this little block right here. It looks like it missed an entire section. And this is probably because it is on the outer edges of a flight line. I can tell that just because of the strange striations we're seeing across here. Typically, that's going to be an indicator of it being at the end of a scan line, but I could still classify these points. Once again, I would just select the Add Ground Points. It will pop up with that same little helpful dialog, and I can begin the exact same process of drawing around these. However, you may see these weird patterns here where it's only selecting a few points. That is because I'm viewing by 10, so it is drawing the display amongst those points. Once again, clicking spacebar will commit those to your temporary class. Just to show you a little bit more of what that looks like, if I go to points, you can see this is the end of our scan line where our points start to spread out because our drone is slowing down. Okay. If there were points on an object that I did not want in my ground class, so let me find an example here. Let's say over here, maybe because we understand our project area, maybe this area here should not have been classified at all. Maybe it was a specific project area, maybe there's some kind of construction going on there, and we don't want it included in our contours. That's okay. You can then use the Remove button to remove those from your ground class. So just like the other tool, you can select using a polygon. In this case, it will not select the unclassified points. It will only select your ground points, and you will once again click spacebar to remove those. Okay. Very easy to use, but once again, when you are doing this particular type of classification, I would recommend doing it in the immersive view because you are able to visualize your surface better than you can in the map view. Okay. Does anyone have any questions on these two particular functionalities? All right. So for our next option inside of this tool, we also have the assisted ground cleanup. Now, the assisted ground cleanup will perform the classification for you based on the cleanup mode that you have selected. We always recommend that you start with normal because if you start off with aggressive, you may end up over-classifying some of your points. So in this case, I could do my exact same classification in this area by going by polygon and drawing around the desired area I would wish to classify. For this one, you will double click to submit that, and it will run that classification. Again, it is using a temporary class, which can be seen in blue. For those of you that may struggle with color blindness or something of that nature, you can change this color because I do know that blue and gray can kind of blend together a little bit. So if you would like to do that, you can go into your live view filter, find your class 20 or the ignored ground class, you can see here, and double click on the color to specify a new one if you so wish. Again, this is entirely optional. This is more for viewing purposes. So for the rest of our exercise, just to make it a little easier on our eyes, I'm going to select the yellow class or yellow color. That way we can see those points really pop out against our surrounding surface. Now remember, I did start off with the normal classification mode. There are 5 modes ranging from normal to extreme, and I do recommend moving down these lists while you're classifying to ensure you don't over-classify any points. So I can do the exact same thing in the same area to test how these results work. As you can see, they do slowly start to build up in your cleanup modes and can be executed as many times as you wish in a given area. Since this tool does run very quickly, it is very easy to use, and you also have the ability to execute over your entire last layer. Now, if you are using something like very aggressive, steep slope, or extreme, I do not recommend using the by layer option, as you will often get classification of your vehicles or other such objects. If I wanted to, I could very quickly run my normal to see if maybe you can help me get some of these small spots that were missed during our initial classification. As you can see, it will take longer to run if you decide to choose that option as well. That is the same with our ground classification Adaptive 10 PCT. The larger the area used for execution, the longer it will take to process. So do keep that in mind when you are working with large data sets. In this case, with the normal, you can see all these little spots that it did pick up for me, including some in that area with the low-lying vegetation and additional stockpiles. Once again, if you are satisfied with these results, you can always click Commit Edits, and it will submit those to the ground class. If you are dissatisfied with your results, you can reset them at any given time. Reset not only allows you to resubmit your edit class, you can also reset your ground and your outliers if need be. So this allows you to execute this without having to create a new unclassified PCT like we did at the start of our previous training session. For this example, I will only undo my edits. You can do it in a given area. So let's say right here, I was dissatisfied with the way it performed. And I could do it by, let's say, a circle. With the circle, you can specify the size just by left-clicking and dragging your mouse. And release when you are satisfied with the selection. As you can see, it will also crawl up onto some of our buildings. So this is actually the edge of a building. So this would be another example of somewhere I would not want included in my surrounding ground class. So I can come through and remove this one very quickly. So as you can imagine, this tool is incredibly helpful for some quick cleanup. So for the remaining points that I've detected, I will go ahead and commit those using that same process as before. So the commit edits option. Click yes and confirm. And it will commit those to the class I desire. Now there are a few other options for that. Give me one moment just to save that change that I made. Now, as I mentioned, only this tool will use your temporary class. All other cleanup options that I will be discussing today will not utilize this function. It will submit directly to your ground class. That means you will have to do manual cleanup of that as well using the same method. Now, some of the other methods include tools on the classification ribbon. As you can see here, we can specify that our source is going to be our ground and edits filter. So that means it will only enable our ground classification and our cleaned up temporary class. If you would like to view those points at any time, we also have a built-in filter. So if I click this drop down and I look for ground and edits system, it will enable only the functions I am interested in. Now we can also very easily see there is something here that probably shouldn't be. It's more than likely not part of my surface. So something else we saw in our previous exercise that we will also be doing throughout today, or this one, is our profile view classifier. Now to do that, I can draw straight across any object that I do not want in my class, draw a little bit wider than that object, and we can observe that feature here. Now I can see there are a few points above what appears to be my ground. My personal favorite tool to use is the classify above and below align. So in this case, I'm going to choose the above align option. From there, I can literally click along what appears to be my surface. Any points that fall above this particular line will be moved to the specified destination class. When I'm satisfied with my selection, I will simply hit spacebar to commit those edits. Okay. Now for some that are working with smaller data sets, you can go across your entire data set doing that, identifying any areas that may not align with your ground. So here I can see there are a few that appear to fall above my ground surface. If I wanted to view all of these points to identify if that's vegetation or not, I can simply switch back to my all points system. When I do that, we can see there is some above ground feature that resides in this area. So when I go back to my edits, I know that these need to be removed. Okay. The profile does allow you to scroll through your entire data set, searching for these points, and I can see that I have several here that should not have been. If I would like to increase the depth of my profile so I don't have to scroll quite as slowly, you can also do that while you are still in this viewer. You can do that by clicking on your Modify Profile Depth button, and you can specify any depth that you would like. In this case, I'm going to choose 20 feet. Yep. Now, when I change over to that, it makes it a little bit more apparent when there are objects above your ground. If you are working with an area that has significant change in its elevation, meaning it is going up and down with rolling hills, something of that nature, it may not be as easy to visualize this in the profile view. When it is relatively flat, as you can see here, I can also increase this to something as high as 100, and I can still see those points above my surface. Okay. Once again, I can do the same thing I did before, so I begin selecting just above my ground surface. All the points that I have selected will be highlighted in white, and we can click spacebar. This allows for very quick and easy cleanup to remove any points from our class. As previously discussed, you can also use your paintbrushes when you see these peaks in this fashion. Typically, those are going to be above ground objects. Once again, a very quick way to visualize those is in the 3D viewer. I will typically draw it right here, and you can see we did get points on top of a roof or some other vertical object that is now causing this peak of sorts. These are really easy to remove from your ground surface and very easy to detect in the map view, and can be removed with simple paintbrushes. Now, I am a little more meticulous when I go through this particular function for my own projects, and I will nitpick through every little peak that I see. I hope that is beneficial to you guys as well. When objects start to appear in this fashion where they are very rough, that's typically going to indicate that there's potential vegetation or something else in your ground class. Now, once again, you do not have to use the 3D viewer for this, but I prefer to be able to zoom into these specific areas versus in the immersive view where it displays all of your data. Now, here you can see there are some objects that are being detected. If I switch back over to my all points, we will likely see that this is vegetation. Okay. Now, as a quick note, classification cannot be performed in the 3D viewer. It can only be done in the map view, the profile view, and the immersive. The 3D viewer is intended for viewing and QC processes only. Okay. I will go through this process a couple more times just to show this to you, but when I center up on this, we can see those above ground objects. And if we switch to all points, we can see there might be some ground points underneath here that did not get classified. So before I use my cleanup tool to attempt to classify those other ground points, I'll zoom in just a little bit so you can see there are a few still lying in our ground here. I want to remove the existing ground points that should not be. So the ones in our vegetation. So find my classify above a line. You can also do a classify within a polygon option. So this will allow you to select an entire area of points just like that. Now, again, when you are using classification tools such as these or those found on the classification ribbon, to execute them, you will use the space bar. When using the ground cleanup tool, that one is executed by double-clicking your mouse. All right. So when we're viewing all of our points like we are here, it can be a little difficult to identify some of these areas where your vegetation and ground mix. So typically for these areas, I would recommend decreasing your width of the profile to allow for better visualization. So for this particular area, I will drop it down to, let's say, 3 feet. Now here we can see the ground is relatively flat on either side. So more than likely it is also flat underneath our vegetation. And we can assume this is some vegetation that was classified incorrectly. So I'm going to come through here and grab those points. Now if I scroll through, you can also see those points falling up above our surface, and they can be very easily removed. You also have the ability to use paintbrushes and other such tools where you can just swipe back and forth while left clicking and reclassify those points. If you would like to make your ground pop out a little bit more, we do have our all points big ground filter that we specified in our previous exercise. Let's ensure it is viewing by legend. So in the live view filter, you choose legend, and it will make your ground points pop out significantly compared to the other. When these points are selected, however, as you can see here, they will shrink if you are dissatisfied with this. So let's say for accidents, you may have selected all these points, but I don't want to undo all of them. You can also simply right-click on your mouse and it will stop the classification process. This does count for all viewers. So you can use it in the immersive, the profile, or the map view to stop your classification if points were accidentally selected. Now it appears there's still 1 point hovering up here in my tree. That's okay. I'm going to once again just draw a profile. If I want to do the entire area and get this fairly high point out of there, I will typically draw my profile as wide as the object itself. That way all points are visible. Again, using this tool, I can just come through and brush as much as I want, spacebar, and remove those points from my classification. So looking at some objects below a vegetated surface, so we'll go over here to this section. I am going to open up the immersive view for this part, and we're going to make it much larger for you guys. So let's see here. Or it's going to snap into place. Of course it was. There we are. All right. Now let's see if we can find that same spot. Now, when you are in the immersive view, it does not automatically display all of your points. It does only display a certain density of your points. If you would like to view more, you can increase your density, and it can slow down the performance of your computer. So do keep that in mind when it is attempting to display all of these points. You'll also notice that throughout our classification, we do have, or throughout our data set, we do have these phantom cars. Okay, these were likely traveling by and were only collected in small little spurts throughout the flight. Now, these are not necessarily a problem, but they can sometimes be misclassified, which is why you can do classification in the immersive view to be able to select only objects above the ground, versus if you are looking in the map view, it will select everything below your mouse. So for example, if I did want to work on just this small area down here, I would want to ensure I am zoomed in close on it, and I begin selecting just this one set of points. Now, with this particular tool, it will be using the classification options here on the ribbon. So if I do this and it says, oh, you have selected over 500,000 points, and I am worried this classification will not be what I want it to be, I can simply click no, and it will not perform that classification. Okay. Again, you can also use the cleanup tool. So I see that I have some ground under here that was not classified. Maybe I want to focus on this area a little more. We can reopen our cleanup tool at any time and run it by polygon, but the assisted ground cannot be done in the map in the immersive view, as you see here. This can only be done in the map view or profile. The manual, however, so I see these points here, click add. I am then allowed to select in the immersive view. All right. Now, though we have this tool version, we also have a PCT that I believe is mentioned in our exercise document. For those of you that were following along in this document, I am on the page 192, section 0523. This is a relatively short section, so I will have plenty of time for questions, or if you would like to see a very specific process or tool set, you are more than welcome to ask during this session. We wanted to ensure you guys had plenty of time for that. So outside of just our tool here, there is a PCT version that can also be used, where you can specify your own set of parameters versus using the cleanup mode. Now, if we go to our Point Tasks tab, our Point Tasks ribbon at the top, go into our PCT Manager. All right. Remember, in our previous exercise, we did use the Import button. to import all of these PCTs. Now, the one we are looking for this particular exercise is the ground training cleanup 2 degree 10 centimeters. Click OK. And we're going to review those settings. So under the active PCT settings, there are going to be a few parameters. So feel free to just watch for the section while I discuss these with you. So under the input points filter, as all of our ground filters do, it is only looking at the created never classified group and the unclassified group. That keeps it from classifying any buildings we may have done, any noise points that were classified, or any vegetation that may have been classified prior to this step. Additionally, it is also restricted to our last returns. In our previous exercise, we did talk about setting an elevation range, which can be done for any input of any PCT or export of your desire. Okay, let's close this out. For our boundary seed points, this is only restricted to our ground. Boundary seed points are just letting the algorithm know these are the classified ground points that we have at this time and that we want to use as input to identify surrounding ground points. For our destination class, our seed points that I discussed earlier or briefly mentioned that it utilizes what are called flags. Flags are an additional classifier that can be used to specify unique points within a given class. Now, previously, each of these flags did have a unique purpose. However, now they are more arbitrary and used on a needed basis versus recommendations. So if you guys would like additional information on how to utilize these flags and what they are doing, please let me know. I will happily perform a quick exercise at the end of this for you to demonstrate their importance or use case. This particular PCT is set up in meters, and you may have noticed that our project is set up in feet. That is okay. Whatever units you would prefer to use in any of your PCTs will work without issue in whatever project you see fit, whether it be set in feet or meters. As the same as our adaptive 10 PCT, this one also has an angular threshold and a maximum distance. These are parameters used to identify surrounding ground points when already classified points are provided as input. That means with any existing ground point, it will look around it at a given distance in a given angular threshold and classify any points that fall within that parameter as ground. It will also perform it for however many iterations are input. In this case, it is listed as 15. However, that is going to be a bit excessive because typically past 10 iterations, it is likely going to become redundant and unable to classify any additional points using those particular parameters. Okay. Now that we have discussed the settings here, this particular PCT can only be executed by Polygon. You do not have any other option, and that is because it works in a very specific fashion. Now, I would typically recommend this one for when you are working under vegetation, or maybe you're looking at some ripraps or something like that, where you're going to have a lot more dynamic movement around your ground surface. And I will show you what that looks like. So for this example, I'm going to draw a profile, relatively narrow, underneath my canopy. So right here, but I'm going to make it, let's say, 1/2 foot. So 0.5. Okay. Once that is up, I'm going to scroll down to ensure I can actually see my ground. And I will begin executing by Polygon. Now let me zoom in on this a little bit. You'll notice once I start to click, my profile view will track me, and you'll see it has a yellow line. That indicates the exact point in which I selected in my point cloud. Now I'm just going to draw a small little box around this area, just like this. Whenever I'm finished with that area, I will double click. Once again, we have seen this message several times. It just means you cannot use the undo button. That's okay. But I want you to take note that this is not doing anything now, just sitting here. That is because it is waiting for you to select additional points. Now, this is how it is very helpful when looking underneath Canopy to classify points. Now, what it's waiting for me to do is I can zoom in here, and I can either click to select a point, or I can click in my profile view. So for example, I can see there's a small spot right here that didn't get classified. I can select in here, and it will then show you in yellow where that point is. You can also use the Shift key, holding it down while you're in the profile view, and you can use the arrows to rotate underneath your canopy or over your difficult to classify object. Now, once again here, I can see there are a few points that are not being selected. I can come in here, I can do my best to select them to the best of my ability. You will want to try to get some of these. So here's another little area. It looks like it's not classifying. That does not look like vegetation to me. So I will come in and grab those. And I will rotate this some more to look for additional points that may have been missed underneath my canopy. I don't know about you guys, but it's a little difficult for me to see those tiny points on my screen. Let's switch over to this so I can see them a little better. Here we are. This one, let's say this is some over here. Well, after you're done selecting your points, however many you would like to input, you can then double click. Oh, if it's going to let me. And it will begin executing, and you can see it in the bottom left-hand corner of your dialog. It will then use all of the points that you have selected to classify any surrounding points within that given polygon. I have seen many users utilize this particular cleanup tool over the other just for forestry assessments or things of that nature to get more accurate contours underneath a thick canopy. It has also been seen in agriculture fields, like I said, ripraps, things of that nature that are going to have some kind of dynamic movement across your surface that can be a little more difficult to classify. All right. The same thing can be done outside of the profile view, so you don't need it. But I could do the exact same thing, just drawing around here, because I can see there's many spots it missed for my curb. Double click. Again, it is still going to wait for me to select some points. But when I am using this particular view, it can be a little more difficult to identify only ground points. And it will not highlight quite as well as it does in the profile view. So it's more difficult to identify those points that you are selecting. So in this case, it appears those particular settings are not great for this particular exercise. So that's where it does come in handy that you can run it by polygon, because you can execute this as many times as you like, and you can always come in here and modify the settings. Now, my rule of thumb for this would be if you are working with something with rolling hills or something of that nature, you would want to increase your angle and decrease your distance. For areas with relatively flat terrain, flat objects, you will want to decrease the angle and increase the distance. That is my rule of thumb there. I would also recommend that you always leave the omit edge climbing algorithm, as it will help to prevent it from crawling up the side of your buildings or other such man-made structures. So after that's done, we do have one last PCT that we're going to be running, and this one is the Statistical Noise Point Filter. This is used to look for statistical noise in a given classified group. So what we're going to do is go into our PCT manager once again. Click Add. And for your type, I want you to find Statistical Noise Point Filter. The name of this task will be ground noise. For those of you following along, this is on page 195, section 3, that I am performing right now. And we have a few settings that we are going to want to configure for this particular task. Oop, it appears I've already created one. So I will add a little extra name to it. There we are. Once you have that created, make sure to select it in your manager and click OK. Now let's configure those settings. So under your active PCT settings, I want you to select under your input points filter. We are going to use the toggle all off option. Toggle all off. And we are only going to enable our ground. And you can also select your ignored ground if you are still using it for processing. In this case, I don't think we have any in ignored ground, but we're still going to leave it in place so that I could use this during the cleanup process. So I'm going to click OK here. We are going to ensure we enable both the low points and high points. For this, our output destination here will be the low noise point. You can also choose to separate the high noise, so it'll be the statistical high noise found in the ground class. And you can have this destination set to class 18, high noise. Now, typically for your sample distance, this would be 3 to 5 times the nominal point spacing of your particular data set. If you are unaware of what that value is, we do have a point cloud statistics tool that you can execute for this. And I'll point that out in just a moment. But for now, we're going to use, let's say, 15 feet. For the max standard deviation, we're going to go with 3. Good. We're then going to apply our settings. You can execute this one by any of the given tools that are enabled, so whether it be by polygon or by active layer. Before I actually hit execute, I am going to show you the tool you can use to estimate your nominal point spacing. That is going to be found on the QA/QC ribbon, and it will be your point cloud statistics. So if you were ever doing this on your own and you needed to calculate that value, open this tool up, and I want you to find the nominal point spacing and enable it. We do not have to execute it for this particular exercise, but I would like you guys to be aware that this option does exist for you and for quick generation and assessment. Okay. Now that we've done that, we are going to execute this tool, and I'm going to do it by the active layer because I want to review the statistical noise of my entire point cloud. All right. So I'm going to click yes here. I'm going to let this run. All right. So you'll see it did highlight a few areas in my viewer here. If I wanted to assess the number of points, I can open up my live view filter and click scan. As a quick note, if you ever see these colors highlighted in red, that is just because they have not been updated as the most recent scan. Once I scan them, it will then give you the actual counts. So it looks like we have a lot more noise that has been detected for this. So over 32,000 noise points. But remember, what we were looking at here is the statistical noise. So it's not going to be those same high and low noise points that we saw at the beginning of our previous exercise that were very obvious and were far away from the surface. These are going to be those little pesky tiny points that could be caused by anything from a small object on the surface to maybe some dynamic error in your trajectory. If you wanted to view only your ground and your noise points to identify where those resided, in your live view filter, you can disable everything, enable only your ground and your noise points themselves. So here you can see it actually identified a building over here as a statistical noise point, which is what we would want it to do. It's going to identify areas like that. It's also identifying some areas in these rough patches. Remember, I mentioned if you see a rough patch of a similar visibility, so like this one, it's likely picking up some kind of rough object over the surface, which is most commonly vegetation. Now, with this information, you can either unclassify that noise, even though it's already been removed, or you can use it to identify areas that may need additional cleanup. So, for example, this low noise point here, so it looks like it's a little ditch area. I can draw my little 3D viewer to actually assess what that is. Enable all of those points. So I'm going to close my filter. It's actually down here in the bottom corner because I just minimized it. I'll close that out. No, I do not want to save my edits. And we can actually get a look at what this object is. So it appears to be a well of sorts. So the low noise points that it detected are likely not noise points. They are just going to be a man-made structure below the ground surface. However, it did allow us to highlight this without us having to manually inspect that point to identify it. So as I mentioned before, we do have plenty of classification options. So for example, where we saw these noise points, if we saw them here and we know that this is in fact a solid ground surface in this particular area, you can still always use your manual points. So I can change this to ground here. I can select my all point systems as the input, so it'll select everything in my point cloud, and I can just come in and reclassify these points if I see fit. So this gives you full control over your ground classification process. Now remember, the point cloud that we have been working on throughout this exercise was an AI ground classification. No classification method is going to be perfect. It is always going to require some level of manual cleanup throughout that process, and it does require a human eye to inspect it. Because some areas, like we saw, that get highlighted as noise may not necessarily be noise on your surface. It may be a man-made structure that does not resemble the surrounding area. I know this session has another several minutes. However, those are most of our cleanup and classification tools available to you. Is there anyone that would like me to cover anything else on ground classification? Once again, I did make sure there was plenty of time at the end of this session so that you guys are more than welcome to ask as many questions as you would like. I'm happy to demo any of those in front of you at this time. So as I mentioned earlier in our exercise, we did have some PCTs that used flags, whereas others did not. So initially, when we were performing our assessment, so under the seeds, so I'm just going to open this one up to point out the destination classes. So I'll open this one up for you. If I check the destination, you'll see this one has no flag set. So this was our seed surface. There's no flags on this. It is just a generic ground point. However, if I look at my adaptive 10, so we'll come and find our adaptive 10 here. Open that up to review its destination. So here you will see a point has been set. That means these points do have an additional classifier to them. To show you what that looks like, if I open up my live view filter and I decide I only want to see my seeds. I don't want to see everything else I've classified throughout this exercise. Let me turn off everything but ground. I will double click here and I'm going to set my key point, so that's that flag, to clear. Clear means look at everything except my flags. Don't look at those. Set, in this case, in the live view filter, means only look at my flags. Ignore means pretend I don't have them. Look at everything. Okay? Now, when I apply this, I'm going to minimize here, and we're going to change this back to points. Now, let me do that again. Oop, that's the wrong filter. Here we are. Let me do that again. I hope it's applying. Set. Here we are. That's what I wanted to see. All right. So when we did our adaptive 10 filter, it actually reclassified a lot of these points. But it did not reclassify the points used or classified using our cleanup tool. So these are all the points that I classified using the cleanup PCT. So if I wanted to, I could use these flags with any data set that I'm interested in. So like I said, if I come in here and I click clear, it will show me everything except those points. It may not look like it because we have a lot of ground points here, but especially when you first start out with your ground classification and you only have your seeds and maybe a small patch of ground that you have done the adaptive 10 on, it makes it very easy to identify those areas, and it also allows you to undo one set of your ground points without damaging the others. So for example, in our previous exercise, we were able to run adaptive 10 several different times throughout that hour and a half, and we never undid our seed points throughout that entire exercise. And not only do these work for the key points, this does apply for all of these flags here. When you were setting them inside of your PCT, so if I went here and I was setting my inputs, so let's say here's all my inputs and I only wanted it to look at the flagged points. I could do that same thing that I did before, double click here, and I could click set. It would only look at points that have that flag classifier on it. If they do not, it will pretend they do not exist. Okay. With your destination class, when you click set, it will apply that flag when that new point is classified. If I set it to clear, it will not. It will ignore those points. The actual ignore section, even though I know this verbiage can be confusing, it means it will pretend there are no flags. It will look at every single point in your data set under that given class. Okay. Does that make sense? All right. Do we have any other questions about any of the topics we have covered today? All right. If there are no more questions, I believe that is all the material I have for you on these particular topics. As you can see, we can run through them very quickly. So as long as you do not have a humongous data set, you can be done with about an hour and have your full ground classified. And you can actually do above ground filter, so a height filter, can be used after your ground is classified to classify vegetation, buildings, or anything of that nature. Ground classification is also required for different functionalities inside of LP360. That includes the tree segmentation tool and the power line extractor and the building extractor. If you do not have ground classified before you run these particular workflows or these particular tools, it will not be able to detect your above ground objects because it is not able to separate them from the ground. Other than that, This is fully documented, and once again, it will be recorded and will be uploaded online, including our previous training session. They will be bundled together on our knowledge base. If anyone would like to search our knowledge base, it is support.lp360.com. We have a lot of helpful documents and workflows here, including an entire section dedicated to how to classify ground. That will link you to the related articles. So if I went to my traditional ground method, it will go through all of the sections that were covered today, including the ones that are in your exercise document. It will also link down here towards the bottom to the cleanup tool. And all of the information that we covered today will be fully covered in here. If you would like additional information on the different modes, those are fully documented as well on our knowledge base for the normal, aggressive, very aggressive, steep slope, and extreme cleanup modes. Again, we recommend if you are using the assisted cleanup that you start with the normal class cleanup. If you move directly to extreme, it can overclassify significantly on your data set because that is intended for very steep, dense areas. Okay. There are also recommendations for each type of mode on this particular page. And again, this can be referenced at any time during your classification process.